After 7 years at the same job, my manager looked me in the eyes and said, "Empty your locker, you're fired." I remember the exact weight of those words, how they landed in the middle of the sales floor, loud enough that everyone within earshot turned to look at me, their faces shifting from curiosity to something colder within seconds. Everyone believed I had stolen a diamond necklace. Even my closest coworkers, people I'd shared birthdays and lunch breaks and quiet complaints about difficult customers with for years, walked away without meeting my eyes. I had worked at that jewelry store since I was 27, starting as a part-time associate and working my way up to store administrator, trusted with everything from inventory logs to opening and closing procedures, trusted with keys to cases holding pieces worth more than most people's cars. In 7 years, I had never once given anyone reason to doubt my honesty. I was the person new employees were paired with during training because management knew I'd teach them the right way to handle the merchandise, the right way to treat customers, the right way to be careful with things that mattered. So when a diamond necklace went missing from one of the front display cases on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the last thing I expected was for suspicion to land on me at all. But it did, almost immediately. Security review showed I had been the last person to handle that particular case, adjusting the necklace for a customer who'd wanted a closer look before deciding not to purchase it. When the necklace turned up missing less than an hour later, my manager, a man named Gregory Simmons who had run that store for as long as I'd worked there, called me into his office and told me security footage needed to be reviewed. I remember feeling nervous but not afraid, the nervousness of someone who knows they've done nothing wrong but understands that being questioned still feels uncomfortable regardless of guilt. They pulled footage from one camera, the one positioned above the case I'd been working at, and on it, my hand appeared to dip toward my pocket in a motion that, out of context, looked exactly like concealment. I watched that same clip along with Gregory and 2 members of the loss prevention team, my stomach twisting as I tried to explain that I remembered exactly what had happened in that moment, that I'd been adjusting my glove after helping the customer try on the necklace, that the timing just happened to look damning on a grainy angle from one specific camera. Nobody seemed interested in my explanation. Gregory's face had already hardened into something decided, something that had made up its mind before I'd even opened my mouth. He fired me right there on the sales floor, in front of customers and coworkers alike, his voice pitched loud enough to be heard, and I understood in that instant that he wasn't simply firing me, he was making an example of me, a public demonstration meant to reassure everyone watching that theft would not be tolerated, that consequences would be swift and visible. I stood there in my work blazer, the one I'd ironed that morning like I did every morning, and felt the entire architecture of my professional identity collapse in the span of about 90 seconds. The days after that were some of the loneliest of my life. Word spreads fast in a small industry, and jewelry retail in our city was smaller than people realized, everyone somehow connected to everyone else through some prior job or mutual acquaintance. Coworkers I'd considered friends stopped responding to my texts within a week. A woman I'd worked beside for 4 years, who'd cried on my shoulder after her divorce, didn't even look at me when I ran into her at the grocery store, just turned her cart in the opposite direction like I was something contagious. I understood, in some detached, painful way, that people needed a story that made sense, and a colleague who steals is a much simpler story than the messy uncertainty of not really knowing what happened. I applied to other jewelry stores in those first weeks, still believing I could rebuild something out of the wreckage, but I quickly discovered that word had traveled ahead of me. Interview after interview ended the same way, polite enough on the surface, a promise to follow up that never materialized into an offer. Nobody said it outright, but I understood that my name had become attached to theft in a small, interconnected industry where reputation was the entire currency people traded in. I had spent 7 years building a name I could be proud of, and it had taken less than 2 minutes on a sales floor to unmake it entirely. I might have simply accepted that fate, quietly rebuilt my life doing something unrelated, if it weren't for an insurance investigator named Patricia Kwan who reached out to me almost 3 weeks after I'd been fired. She explained that the store's insurance company required a full review of security footage before processing any claim of this size, not just the single clip management had used to justify my termination, and she wanted to ask me some questions as part of that broader investigation. I remember feeling a strange mixture of hope and exhaustion as I answered her questions, walking her again through exactly what I remembered about that Tuesday afternoon, uncertain whether it would change anything at all. It turned out that the store had multiple camera angles covering that section of the floor, angles nobody had bothered to review when Gregory made his decision to fire me on the spot. When the insurance investigators pulled the full footage from every camera covering that display case over the following hour, a very different picture began to emerge. My hand movement, viewed from a different angle, was clearly nothing more than adjusting my glove exactly as I'd said. But more importantly, the footage showed something nobody had thought to look for, because nobody had thought there was any reason to keep watching once they had a clip that seemed to confirm what they already wanted to believe. 20 minutes after I'd walked away from that case entirely, footage from a different camera showed Gregory himself approaching it, alone, the store momentarily quiet, his body positioned in a way that blocked the case from the camera's clearest view for just under a minute. The investigation that followed uncovered something far larger and darker than a single missing necklace. Gregory, it turned out, had been orchestrating a pattern of staged thefts for months, carefully selecting expensive pieces, removing them himself during quiet moments on the floor, and then constructing narratives that pointed suspicion toward whichever employee happened to have been nearby at the time. He would file insurance claims for the missing merchandise, collect the payout, and then quietly sell the actual pieces through a contact he'd cultivated outside the business, someone willing to move jewelry without asking too many questions about where it had come from. I had not been his first target. 2 other employees before me had been quietly let go under similarly vague circumstances over the preceding year, their reputations damaged in smaller, less public ways, though none of their situations had involved a firing quite as dramatic or as public as mine. Learning this filled me with an anger I hadn't fully let myself feel in the weeks after being fired, when I'd mostly just felt hollow and ashamed despite having done nothing wrong. Now I understood that shame had never belonged to me in the first place. I had been selected, deliberately, as a convenient scapegoat for a scheme that had nothing to do with me at all, my 7 years of quiet reliability apparently making me an easy, believable target precisely because nobody would expect someone with my record to suddenly become a thief, which made the accusation, paradoxically, land with more force rather than less. Gregory was arrested a few weeks after the investigation concluded, the evidence against him too substantial to ignore once investigators started connecting the pattern across multiple incidents. The company that owned the store issued a formal apology to me, delivered through a stiff, carefully worded letter from corporate that felt more concerned with limiting liability than genuinely reckoning with what had happened to me. They offered me my old position back, framed as a generous gesture, as though returning me to the exact place where I had been humiliated in front of everyone I knew could somehow undo the damage that had already been done. I sat with that offer for exactly as long as it took to read the letter once. Then I called the human resources representative who'd signed it and told her, calmly, that I appreciated the acknowledgement but wouldn't be returning. She seemed surprised, started to explain the benefits of the position, the seniority I'd be reinstated with, as though I simply hadn't understood the offer correctly. I told her the truth instead. You took away something more valuable than my job, I said. You took away my reputation. That distinction mattered to me more than I think she understood. A job could be replaced. Reputation, once damaged, takes something far harder to rebuild, the quiet trust of everyone who knew your name before they knew the story attached to it. Even with Gregory arrested, even with the company's public apology circulating through the same small industry that had once turned its back on me, I knew there would always be people who remembered the headline more clearly than the correction, people who'd think of me, even fleetingly, in connection with a scandal rather than with the 7 years of honest work that preceded it. So I didn't go back. Instead, I spent the following months doing something I'd quietly dreamed about for years but never had the courage to pursue while I had a stable, comfortable position to protect. I began the slow, difficult process of opening my own small jewelry boutique, using the severance and settlement the company eventually offered as a foundation, along with savings I'd built over years of careful, disciplined work. I chose every piece for that store myself, sourced from small designers and ethical suppliers, built relationships with customers based on the same honesty and care I'd always brought to my work, except now that honesty answered to no one but myself. It wasn't easy. There were nights I sat alone in that small shop after closing, exhausted, uncertain whether I'd made the right choice walking away from a stable paycheck to gamble everything on something so fragile and new. But slowly, customers began to return, some of them former clients from my years at the old store who remembered exactly the kind of person I'd always been, regardless of what a viral rumor had briefly suggested otherwise. Word began to travel in the opposite direction this time, not a story about theft, but a story about a woman who'd been wrongly accused and had rebuilt something entirely her own out of the wreckage. Sometimes the hardest thing to rebuild isn't your career. It's your good name. I think about that distinction almost every day now, standing behind the counter of a store that belongs entirely to me, greeting customers who trust me not because a corporation vouches for me, but because I built that trust one honest interaction at a time, brick by brick, the same slow way I once built my reputation the first time, before it was taken from me so carelessly. Would you have gone back to that job after everything?